It was a quiet morning in a small suburban home, the kind of place where time seemed to move a little slower. 74-year-old Robert Mitchell sat at his kitchen table with a steaming paper cup of gas station coffee, the kind he always bought because it was cheap and strong. Today was supposed to be special. It was his granddaughter's birthday, and he planned to withdraw a few $100s from his retirement account to buy her a new bicycle, something bright red with a bell on the handlebar. He opened his old laptop, the keys worn smooth from years of cautious typing. His heart gave a small flutter as he typed in his credentials. The screen loaded, and then silence. The number stared back at him in cold digital font balance 0 talent. $600,000, 30 years of sweat sacrifice, skipped vacations. Secondhand shoes gone. The coffee cup slipped from his trembling hands and shattered against the floor, brown liquid spreading across his worn leather shoes. His breath caught in his chest. 30 years. Gone overnight, he whispered. A ringing cut through the silence. The phone. He snatched it up. Mr. Mitchell, a calm voice from the bank said this wasn't a system error. A withdrawal request was signed, verified, and processed under your name. Robert froze, his mind spinning. His voice cracked. I never signed anything. And then the question that would haunt him echoed in his mind. What if the betrayal came not from strangers, but from the son he had once trusted with everything? If this were your life savings, would you forgive, or would you walk away forever? Comment below with what you would do. Robert Mitchell had spent his entire life working in the steel mills of Ohio. The clang of metal and the heat of the furnace had been his reality for decades. He lived frugally, not because he was miserly, but because he wanted to ensure he would never become a burden to his children. Every cent saved, every overtime shift taken, every vacation skipped, all of it went into the retirement fund he had trusted to secure his final years. His small suburban house was as modest as his habits. A faded American flag fluttered quietly on the porch, a symbol of his pride in country and in hard work. On Sundays, he still walked to the local church where he would bow his head in the same wooden pew he had sat in for nearly 50 years. Neighbors often waved to him as he passed, admiring the man who had raised his sons with discipline, faith, and humility. Inside his home, everything spoke of a careful, humble life. The old recliner by the television, the stack of Reader's Digest magazines, the framed photographs of fishing trips and birthday parties. The kitchen clock ticked loudly, filling the quiet house with a rhythm of constancy. It was the kind of house where life felt predictable, safe, untouched by betrayal. His eldest son, Michael, was everything Robert once hoped for. Tall, confident, successful with a job in finance that paid handsomely. To outsiders, Michael was the model of a devoted son, always dropping by, always asking, "Dad, do you need anything fixed?" But behind that polished smile, there lingered a coldness Robert couldn't quite name. Michael had insisted on helping his father set up online banking, saying, "Dad, you need to modernize. Let me take care of the tech stuff." Robert, unfamiliar with computers, had reluctantly agreed. Then there was Daniel, the youngest, who lived 3 states away. He didn't have money, didn't wear tailored suits, and didn't own a big house. But every phone call ended with the same words. "Love you, Dad. Don't forget to take your meds." Daniel didn't send expensive gifts. Instead, he sent warmth, honesty, and loyalty, the things Robert valued most. Sometimes Robert's neighbors would see him sitting on the porch with his coffee, and they would stop to chat. "Still saving every penny, huh?" Bob, one would tease. He would laugh, answering, "Gotta make sure the kids don't carry me on their backs." He had said it with pride, never imagining his own son would be the one to try. Flashbacks often haunted Robert now. He remembered standing by the lake with Michael at age 10, handing him a fishing pole. "Listen to me, son," Robert had said gently. "Money isn't worth a damn if you lose your soul." Michael had nodded wide-eyed, promising he would never forget. But promises made by children sometimes evaporate with age. And now in the present, the bank had delivered devastating proof. An official envelope slid through his mailbox, crisp and clinical. Inside lay the withdrawal form, digitally signed, stamped, authenticated. The e-signature was flawless, indistinguishable from Robert's own hand. Worse still, there was a recording, Robert's voice calm and steady saying, "Yes, I authorize this transaction." His hands shook as he replayed the audio. It sounded so real, his tone, his phrasing, even the little cough he often gave before speaking. How could he deny what felt undeniable? If he didn't remember doing this, was it possible that age had betrayed him, or had someone closer, someone he trusted, used his very identity against him? The seed of suspicion was planted, though Robert could not yet bring himself to water it. He wanted to believe in family and loyalty and the lessons he had spent a lifetime teaching. But the shadows creeping around his life whispered of betrayal, and the whisper grew louder each passing day. Robert sat in his recliner, the withdrawal form trembling in his hands. He called Michael, his eldest son, asking him to come over immediately. Within the hour, Michael arrived, crisp suit and tie, holding his phone as if it were an extension of his hand. Robert looked at him with pleading eyes. "Michael," he said softly, "why would my account be empty? $600,000 gone. I never signed anything." Michael's jaw tightened. He sat across from his father, crossing one leg over the other with a lawyer's poise. "Dad, you signed the form. Maybe you don't remember, but the bank has everything. The e-signature, the voice log. It's done." His words were calm, but his tone carried a sharp edge, as if he were scolding a child. Robert's heart dropped. He whispered, I would never. Are you saying I'm losing my mind?" Michael gave a practiced sigh. "Dad, you're 74. Memory slips happen. We should be realistic." The next day, the family gathered in Robert's living room. Michael sat beside his wife, Lisa, who crossed her arms and looked Robert over with cool detachment. "Look," Lisa said firmly, "he's old. It's irresponsible to let him handle this alone. We should be managing his finances now." Robert's knuckles whitened against the armrest of his chair. "I have managed my money my whole life, 30 years of saving. I did not sign that form." But Michael only looked at him with pity, the kind of pity that cut deeper than anger. "Dad, sometimes we don't remember what we've done." The words echoed like a death sentence. Robert stared at the floor, wondering if his mind truly had betrayed him. The doubt gnawed at him louder with every tick of the clock. Was he slipping into Alzheimer's? Was this what the rest of his life would be? Confusion, humiliation, dependency. That night, Robert couldn't sleep. Memories rushed back in painful fragments. He remembered working the night shift at the mill, sweat pouring down his back while his co-workers went home to families and birthday cakes. He had missed Daniel's 8th birthday, arriving home at dawn to find half-eaten cake on the table and wrapping paper scattered on the floor. He had kissed his sleeping son on the forehead and whispered, "This is for your future. One day you'll understand." He remembered Michael's high school graduation. He had worn the same suit he'd had for years because buying a new one would mean cutting into the retirement fund. Michael had hugged him that night and said, "Thanks for everything, Dad." "I'll make you proud." Robert buried his face in his hands. What had gone wrong? Where had the promises gone? The following week, Michael accompanied Robert to the bank. A manager sat them down, pulling up the account records. "Mr. Mitchell," the manager said, "we've reviewed everything. The withdrawal was authenticated from a trusted device with valid credentials. Here is the log." He turned the screen toward them. The IP address was listed as one Robert had used before, though he couldn't recall when. Robert felt dizzy. He rubbed his temples. Could it really have been him? The thought was unbearable. If his memory was failing, then perhaps Michael and Lisa were right. Perhaps he wasn't capable anymore. Back at home, the tension grew. Lisa spoke to Michael in the kitchen, thinking Robert couldn't hear. "He's slipping, Mike. This is exactly why we need to step in. If we don't, he'll lose everything anyway." Michael's voice was low, but Robert caught a fragment. "Don't worry, I've got it under control." The words chilled him to the bone. Under control. What did that mean? He sat in silence. The house that had once echoed with laughter, now heavy with suspicion. His mind kept circling the same questions. Had he lost his memory? Or was he being made to believe he had one evening as he stared at the fishing photo of young Michael? The phone rang. It was Daniel. "Dad," his youngest son's voice came through, filled with warmth. "I heard about the account. You would never forget something like this. Something's wrong. I'll come." Robert closed his eyes, relief flooding him. At least one person still believed in him. One voice still cut through the fog of doubt. The next days blurred together. Robert found himself drifting through the house, staring at objects that once carried joy. The framed family portrait from a Christmas long ago, the fishing rod propped in the corner, the old pocket watch passed down from his father. Each item reminded him of the life he had built for his children, and each one whispered of betrayal. Lisa stopped by more frequently now, checking cupboards, moving bills into neat stacks, speaking loudly as if Robert had already lost his hearing along with his memory. "You see," she said to Michael one afternoon while Robert sat silently in his recliner, "he can't keep track anymore. This is why the money has to be in our hands." Robert wanted to shout to defend himself, but exhaustion weighed heavier than anger. Every time he opened his mouth, the doubt returned. Had he perhaps signed something forgotten? It mistaken his own actions. His reflection in the hallway mirror looked older than ever, the lines on his face etched deeper by suspicion and despair. At night, he replayed the voice recording again and again. It was him without question, the tone, the phrasing, the cough. But deep inside, a small ember of resistance burned. "I know myself," he whispered into the dark. "I didn't do this." Still the fear lingered. What if everyone else was right? What if he truly was fading? The whispers in the community began too. At church, old friends pulled him aside, speaking softly. "Bob, I heard about your account. Maybe it's time to let Michael manage things. He's successful. He knows finance." Robert forced a smile, nodding politely, but inside the shame cut deep. His reputation built over decades was unraveling. One neighbor stopped by with a casserole, lowering her voice at the door. "Don't worry, Bob. These things happen when you get older." He thanked her, though the words stung more than comforted. The world already saw him as a man slipping away. Meanwhile, Michael grew bolder. He spoke with the bank more often than Robert did, stepping into conversations, as if the accounts already belonged to him. Sometimes Robert would overhear Michael talking on the phone. "Yes, I have power of attorney. It's just a matter of filing paperwork." The arrogance made Robert's stomach twist. But what could he do if the bank believed Michael? If the law believed Michael, then truth itself could be stolen. Memories continued to flood Robert's nights. He recalled Lisa's first Thanksgiving with the family, how she had praised his cooking and called him Dad with a smile that felt genuine. How quickly things had soured. Now her eyes carried no warmth, only calculation. One evening, Robert sat at the kitchen table with Daniel on speakerphone. "Dad, listen to me," Daniel urged. "You are not crazy. If you didn't sign, you didn't sign. Technology can fake things. I've read about it. I'm coming." Robert's chest ached with relief. "Thank you, son. You're the only one who still believes me." After the call ended, Robert leaned back and stared at the ceiling. For the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope returned. Maybe he wasn't powerless after all. Maybe Daniel could uncover what he could not. But even with that glimmer of hope, fear loomed large. Every sound in the house, creaking floors, the hum of the fridge, felt like reminders that time was running out. He feared that by the time Daniel arrived, it might be too late. The courts could rule. The money could vanish forever. As he drifted to sleep in his recliner, Robert whispered to himself, "Hold on. Just hold on. Daniel is coming." And for the first time in days, he allowed himself a thin, fragile smile. But the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to whisper, otherwise perhaps betrayal had already taken root deeper than he imagined. The battle for truth was only beginning. Daniel arrived late at night, his suitcase still in his hand as he stepped onto the porch. Robert opened the door before his son could knock, his eyes moist with both exhaustion and relief. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to lean into an embrace. "Dad," Daniel whispered, squeezing him tightly. "I'm here now. You don't have to face this alone." They sat at the kitchen table, the old lamp casting a weak glow. Papers were spread across the surface, bank statements, printouts, scribbled notes Robert had made in shaky handwriting. Daniel listened carefully as Robert explained everything: the empty account, the signature, the recording. His brows furrowed deeper with every detail. "This doesn't add up," Daniel said firmly. "If you didn't authorize it, then someone made it look like you did. And I'm willing to bet it wasn't strangers." He didn't say Michael's name, but the implication hung heavy in the air. Robert lowered his head, ashamed. "Your brother, he says I signed. That I just don't remember." Daniel shook his head. "Dad, I've known you my whole life. You don't forget things like this. This isn't memory loss, it's manipulation." That night, Daniel set up his laptop on the same kitchen table where Robert had counted pennies for decades. He requested the digital access logs from the bank, combing through them with meticulous care. Robert watched nervously as lines of data scrolled across the screen. Daniel's fingers paused over the keyboard. Here, he said, pointing. These logins came from Michael's house, his Wi-Fi network, his IP address. This isn't random, it's deliberate. Robert's chest tightened. My own son. The words barely escaped his lips. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll prove it. But we need more than this. Courts don't just take suspicions. We'll need hard evidence. Over the next few days, Daniel dug deeper. He checked Robert's old desktop computer, sifting through browser histories and system logs. It was dusty, the kind of machine that hadn't been updated in years. What he found was telling no record of logins to the retirement account during the time of the withdrawals. This clears you? Dad, Daniel said, printing out the system report. If you never access the account from here, then the bank logs don't make sense unless someone else used your credentials. Robert let out a shaky breath. So I wasn't losing my mind. You never were, Daniel said gently. But Michael wants you to think you are. Robert straightened his shoulders for the first time in weeks. He began printing statements, organizing folders, even ironing the shirt he planned to wear in court. He walked to the church one morning and spoke quietly to the pastor. God knows I never signed it, he confessed, his voice trembling. The pastor laid a hand on his shoulder and said, Then the truth will come to light, Bob. It always does. Still, Michael's presence loomed large. He visited one afternoon unannounced, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Dad, all this paperwork, it's unnecessary. The bank already verified everything. You're only making yourself look worse. Daniel stood between them. Or maybe we're closer to proving the truth, Michael sneered. Daniel, you live 3 states away. You don't know what Dad's like these days. He forgets things. He gets confused. Lisa and I have been here. We've seen it. Robert's fists clenched at his sides. I may be old, Michael, but I am not confused. Do not mistake my silence for weakness. Lisa appeared behind Michael, smirking. The court will decide soon enough, and when it does, you'll thank us for taking control. The tension in the room was thick like steel about to bend. Daniel pulled his father aside later that night. We have to move faster. There's something else here. I found traces of a fintech service in the logs. It looks like Michael used a platform to create or verify the e-signature. Robert's eyes widened. Can we prove it? Not yet, Daniel admitted, but the platform keeps redundant records. If we can subpoena those, it'll show exactly who authorized the transaction and from where. Robert sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he whispered, Tomorrow the court will decide whether I am senile or betrayed. He stared at the ceiling, praying that the truth would find its way through the cracks of lies surrounding him. The following morning, Robert awoke to the sound of Daniel typing furiously at his laptop. The younger son had been up all night searching for more connections, more traces that would expose Michael's betrayal. Robert shuffled into the kitchen, the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Daniel glanced up, eyes bloodshot but determined. I found something, he said. The fintech service Michael used, it leaves digital fingerprints, logs, metadata, all of it. If we can get access, it will show exactly who signed and from which device. That's the smoking gun. Robert leaned heavily on the counter. Will the court believe it? Daniel nodded slowly. If we can get it admitted, yes. But Michael will fight it. He's already ahead, controlling the narrative. He wants the court to believe you're incompetent. Later that day, Michael returned with Lisa. They stood in the doorway like landlords inspecting a tenant. Lisa spoke first. Bob, this has gone on long enough. You should just admit you signed and forgot. There's no shame in aging. Robert's eyes narrowed. The shame isn't in aging. The shame is in betrayal. Michael stepped forward, his voice rising. Dad, stop embarrassing yourself. I've taken care of everything. The bank, the paperwork, it's all handled. Tomorrow the court will rule and you'll finally stop clinging to this fantasy. Daniel slammed his fist on the table. This isn't a fantasy. We have proof. We'll show the court exactly who's lying. Michael smirked, but his jaw twitched a flicker of nerves. You're chasing shadows. Courts don't care about your half-baked theories. Robert studied his eldest son, seeing him not as the proud graduate in a borrowed suit, but as a stranger with cold eyes. The betrayal stung sharper than any wound he had endured at the mill. He thought of all the birthdays missed, all the hours of sweat traded for dollars that now dangled in the hands of deceit. That evening, Robert returned to the church. He knelt at the altar long after service had ended, whispering prayers into the quiet sanctuary. Lord, I have tried to be a good father. I have worked, I have saved, I have given. If I have failed, forgive me. But let the truth be seen. Please, let the truth be seen." His tears fell silently onto the worn wood. Back home, Daniel prepared binders full of evidence. He arranged timelines, logs, witness statements, anything to counter Michael's claims. Robert helped where he could, though his hands shook as he held the papers. "All my life," he murmured, "I thought saving would protect us. I never imagined my greatest enemy would share my blood." The night before, court tension gripped the house. Robert barely slept, rising at every creak and whisper. Daniel sat awake too, staring at his laptop screen, refreshing his inbox again and again, hoping for a reply from the fintech service. But no email came. Time was slipping away. In the early hours of morning, a storm rattled the windows. Lightning lit up the living room where Robert sat with Daniel. The storm outside seemed to echo the storm within. "Tomorrow decides everything," Robert said softly. "Either they'll call me senile, or they'll call me betrayed." Daniel placed a steady hand on his father's shoulder. "They'll call you what you've always been, the man who never stopped fighting for what's right." As dawn broke, Robert buttoned his shirt with deliberate care. He looked at himself in the mirror, straightened his tie, and for the first time in weeks saw not a confused old man, but the steelworker who had endured a lifetime of hardship. His dignity, though battered, remained intact. Together, father and son stepped out into the gray morning, each carrying the weight of 30 years of sacrifice. The courthouse loomed in the distance, its stone walls a fortress where truth and lies would soon collide. Every step Robert took was heavy, yet filled with resolve. He would not be silent. He would not be erased. Whatever the verdict, the world would know he had fought to the end. The courthouse steps felt like a mountain as Robert climbed them the next morning. His knees ached, but he refused to show weakness. Daniel stayed close, carrying the binders of evidence like a soldier protecting vital documents. The air was crisp, the kind that burned his lungs, reminding him that life itself demanded resilience. As they approached the doors, Michael was already there, adjusting his tie with practiced ease. Lisa stood beside him, arms folded, eyes gleaming with anticipation, ready to face reality. "Dad," Michael said smoothly, "the judge will see the truth today." Robert paused, meeting his eldest son's gaze. "The truth has been with me my whole life, Michael. It's you who turned away from it." Inside the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks whispered to one another, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. Robert sat beside Daniel, his hands folded tightly together. For the first time, he felt less like a victim and more like a man on the edge of battle. Daniel leaned close. "The fintech company still hasn't replied, but I know they will. And when they do, everything changes." Robert nodded. "Then we hold the line until the truth arrives." The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise." As the judge entered, Robert lifted his head. His heart pounded in rhythm with the gavel striking wood. This was it, the moment that would define whether 30 years of sacrifice would be remembered as wisdom or erased as senility. Either way, the fight was no longer in the shadows. It was here, under the eyes of the law, where betrayal and truth would finally collide. The courtroom was a cathedral of silence, its wooden benches lined with faces both curious and judgmental. Robert sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly in front of him. His heart pounded against his ribs as if it were trying to escape. Daniel sat beside him, adjusting the binders of evidence they had gathered, though his jaw was tight with worry. Across the aisle, Michael looked calm and confident, his suit immaculate, Lisa's smug smile glowing like victory already secured. The judge entered, the bailiff's voice booming, "All rise." Everyone stood. Robert's knees ached, but he forced himself upward, refusing to look weak. As the judge settled, the gavel struck once, echoing like a drumbeat of fate. The bank's attorney rose first. "Your Honor, the matter is straightforward. Mr. Robert Mitchell authorized the withdrawal of $600,000 from his retirement account. The institution acted in good faith, processing his authenticated request. Here we present the verified documents." A projector lit up, displaying the digital withdrawal form. Robert's signature appeared in neat blue strokes identical to every check he had ever written. The attorney continued. "Additionally, we have audio verification," Mr. Mitchell's voice confirming the authorization. The voice log was captured, stored, and verified as authentic. The recording played. Robert's stomach twisted as he heard his own voice fill the room. Yes, I authorized this transaction. It was eerie, uncanny, so perfect that even he, the man who never spoke those words, almost doubted himself. Murmurs rippled through the benches. An old friend from church leaned toward another sounds just like him. Robert closed his eyes. The sound of his own voice condemning him was unbearable. When the audio ended, the attorney turned confidently toward the judge. The evidence speaks for itself. Michael stood then, buttoning his jacket with theatrical calm. Your Honor, I am Robert's eldest son. I have been by his side throughout this process. My father has moments of lucidity, yes, but he also suffers from confusion. He forgets things. He repeats himself. It pains me to say this, but I believe his condition has made him vulnerable to mistakes. Robert's mouth went dry. Michael's words were delivered with such compassion, such feigned heartbreak, that the spectators in the courtroom began nodding sympathetically. Lisa dabbed her eyes with a tissue for effect. Daniel shot to his feet. That's a lie. My father is sharp. He remembers everything that matters. If he says he didn't sign it, he didn't. The judge raised a hand. Mr. Mitchell, control yourself. Daniel sat seething while Robert forced himself to stand. His knees trembled, but he looked the judge in the eye. Your Honor, I have worked for 30 years to build that retirement fund. I have lived modestly, sacrificed, and saved. I would never drain it all, not in one day. That voice may sound like me, but I swear before God it was not me. His voice cracked on the last words, the sound so fragile it barely carried across the room. Silence followed, heavy and suffocating. A few spectators glanced down, uncomfortable. The judge scribbled notes without expression. Michael shook his head, looking pained as if it hurt him to watch his father unravel. Robert sank back into his chair. Doubt crept in again, dark and poisonous. What if the others were right? What if age had stolen his memory, leaving only fragments? Could he truly trust himself anymore? He had always been strong, always certain, but now certainty felt like sand slipping through his fingers. Daniel leaned close, whispering, "Don't give up. We'll prove it." Robert stared at his son's determined face, remembering a night decades earlier when Daniel had cried at a thunderstorm. He had held the boy then, whispering, "I'm here. I'll protect you." And now it was Daniel protecting him. The circle of time had reversed, and it both warmed and broke his heart. The bank's attorney called a witness, a digital forensics specialist. She explained the authentication process, how e-signatures were verified, how voice logs were stored. Her language was clinical, confident, convincing. Every word felt like another nail in Robert's coffin. Daniel cross-examined, but could only force minor concessions. Yes, theoretically a voice could be faked, but our systems are reliable. The jury nodded along. Reliability sounded stronger than theory. As testimony ended, Robert drifted into reflection. His mind wandered back to the mill, to nights of fire and iron, to hands blistered raw from work. He remembered payday envelopes, half the cash going into savings before he even bought groceries. He remembered telling Michael, "This money is your safety, your future. Guard it with honesty." And now here he was accused of squandering it, betrayed by the very one he had entrusted. The weight of a lifetime pressed on his chest. He wondered if everything he had done, the sweat, the saving, the sacrifice, had been for nothing. Was this the legacy of his life, to be remembered not as a man of discipline, but as a confused old fool? Tears burned his eyes, but he blinked them back. He would not cry in front of Michael. Not here, not yet. Just as the judge announced a recess, Daniel's phone buzzed. He glanced down, eyes widening. A new email notification glowed on the screen from the fintech company. His breath caught. He met his father's eyes and whispered, "Dad, they just replied." Robert gripped his son's hand, hope surging through the fog of despair. But the contents of that message remained unopened, for now the cliffhanger lingered like a held breath in the courtroom air. "There's one more piece of evidence you need to see," Daniel whispered, and Robert felt the faintest flicker of light in the darkness. The recess felt like a lifetime. Robert sat in the quiet corridor outside the courtroom, the echo of footsteps and murmurs bouncing off marble walls. Daniel clutched his phone like a lifeline, the unopened email glowing on the screen. His hands trembled as he hovered over the message. "Open it," Robert whispered. "Whatever it says, we need to know." Daniel tapped the screen. The email unfolded, lines of technical language filling the display. At first, Robert couldn't make sense of it, but Daniel's face slowly transformed relief, mixing with triumph. "They logged the transaction," Daniel said breathlessly. "And it wasn't from here. It came from Michael's IP address. Not only that they stored a backup copy of the voice file, it shows metadata AI-generated, deepfake. Robert's chest tightened. So it wasn't me. It was never you, Daniel said fiercely. Dad, this is it. This proves everything. But the email was only a piece of paper until it was shown in court. Daniel forwarded it to their attorney, but the man frowned. We'll have to petition the judge to admit this. It might not be allowed at the last minute. Robert closed his eyes. The thought of losing, even with truth in their hands, was unbearable. But he reminded himself of the steel mill, the long nights, the furnace heat, the endless labor. Life had never been easy. Why should justice be? When court resumed, Michael looked even more smug than before. He placed a hand dramatically on his father's shoulder as they passed in the aisle. Dad, he whispered, don't fight this. You'll only embarrass yourself further. Robert pulled away, fire flickering in his tired eyes. The only embarrassment here is what you've become. Back at the defense table, Daniel scribbled notes, preparing to present the new evidence. But Robert's thoughts drifted again, carried back through decades of sacrifice. He remembered the day he paid off the house mortgage, standing in the yard with the deed in hand, raising it like a trophy while Michael and Daniel clapped. He remembered Lisa's wedding, how he had given them money for a down payment on their first home. Every act of generosity, every moment of pride, now soured by betrayal. The judge returned, gavel striking. Court is back in session. Daniel stood. Your Honor, we respectfully request to submit newly received evidence from the fintech company. It directly contradicts the bank's verification and proves manipulation. The bank's attorney objected immediately. Your Honor, this is irregular last-minute material. It should not be admitted. The judge raised an eyebrow. What kind of evidence? Daniel held up the phone. Digital logs, metadata, and a secondary audio file stored on the fintech servers. It shows the transaction originated from the residence of Michael Mitchell. It also demonstrates that the so-called voice recording was synthesized, a deep fake. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Michael's jaw tightened, though he tried to maintain composure. Lisa's eyes darted nervously, her smirk finally cracking. The judge leaned forward. Mr. Mitchell, he said, addressing Robert, is this your contention, that your son fabricated this transaction? Robert rose, his knees steady this time. His voice did not waver. Yes, Your Honor. I built that retirement account dollar by dollar, year by year. I trusted my son with my name, my signature, my future. He betrayed all of it. This evidence proves what I have always known in my heart. I did not authorize those withdrawals. For the first time, the murmurs in the room shifted. Spectators who once pitied him now looked at Michael with suspicion. The tide was turning. The judge tapped his gavel. I will review this evidence. If it is authentic, it changes everything. Robert sat down slowly, exhaling as though releasing decades of burden. Daniel squeezed his shoulder. You see, Dad, the truth fights its way through no matter how dark it gets. Robert allowed himself a faint smile. But deep inside, he knew the war wasn't over. Michael would not give up easily. And the final confrontation had yet to come. The courtroom reconvened after lunch, a charged silence hanging in the air. Robert sat rigid, his hands clasped together on the table while Daniel refreshed his inbox again and again. Finally, the clerk handed a packet of papers to the judge, documents sent directly from the fintech company. The judge adjusted his glasses and skimmed the contents. His brows rose slightly before he spoke. This court has received additional material from the fintech provider. It contains metadata concerning the disputed transaction. We will hear its summary now. The bank's attorney looked rattled, already rising to object, but the judge waved him down. You'll have a chance to respond. Sit. Daniel stood, nerves buzzing in his veins. Your Honor, the evidence shows the transaction did not originate from my father's residence. The login was traced to the Wi-Fi network registered under Michael Mitchell, the eldest son. Furthermore, the voice file purported to be Robert Mitchell's authorization contained signatures consistent with AI synthesis. In layman's terms, it was a deepfake. Gasps filled the courtroom. Spectators leaned forward, whispering furiously. The judge's gavel struck once. Order. Daniel continued, addressing the jury as much as the judge. Deepfake technology can replicate voices with chilling accuracy. It takes samples just seconds of speech and builds an artificial model capable of saying anything. That is what happened here. Michael Mitchell used his access to my father's devices, his knowledge of my father's voice, and exploited financial systems to steal $600,000. All eyes turned to Michael. His confidence faltered. He forced a smile, though sweat beaded on his forehead. That's absurd. Anyone can throw around tech jargon. My father signed, and he just doesn't remember. This is an attempt by my brother to discredit me. But the jury was shifting eyes, narrowing at Michael's defensiveness. The bank's attorney whispered furiously to his colleague, papers shuffling, while Lisa sat stiffly staring at the table. Robert stood slowly but firmly. His voice, though raspy, carried a weight born of decades. "Michael," he said, locking eyes with his son, "I taught you to be honest. I worked in the mill for 30 years, saving every dime so that none of you would suffer, and this is what you do. Forge my voice, my name." Michael's jaw tightened. "You don't understand, Dad. You wasted your life saving pennies, living small. I deserved more. We deserved more. Lisa and I." He cut himself off, realizing too late what he'd confessed. The room erupted in whispers. He admitted it. Someone hissed. Lisa's face drained of color. She avoided Michael's gaze, her lips pressed in a thin line. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Mitchell, are you admitting to authorizing the transaction under false pretenses?" Michael stammered. "No, I mean, it wasn't like that. She pushed me his hand." He spun, suddenly pointing at Lisa. It was her idea. "She said your savings were wasted, that we could put it to better use. She made me do it." Lisa gasped, shaking her head violently. "That's a lie. Don't you dare pin this on me, Michael. You were the one who filed the forms, who set up the logins. I told you it would ruin us if we got caught." The spectators buzzed louder. The sound of betrayal amplified. Robert closed his eyes, agony rippling across his face. To hear his son admit greed, to watch him throw his own wife under the bus, it was worse than losing the money itself. The judge slammed his gavel. "Order, order in this court." His voice carried over the chaos. "These revelations will require careful review. The court will recess until further notice." Robert sat down heavily, the sound of the gavel echoing in his ears. The fight was not over, but the truth had cracked open for all to see. The courtroom buzzed with restless energy as the recess stretched on. Reporters scribbled furiously and spectators whispered theories back and forth. Robert sat quietly, staring at his hands, while Daniel leaned close. "Dad, this is it." He confessed, even if he tried to cover it up. "We just have to hold steady." Robert nodded faintly, though his chest ached. It wasn't victory, he felt it was grief. No evidence, no confession could erase the fact that his own blood had chosen greed over love. When court resumed, the judge's tone was clipped. "We will allow limited cross-examination on the new evidence, but I remind both parties this court is not a circus." The bank's attorney looked pale. He shuffled papers, his voice unsteady as he addressed the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, technology can be misinterpreted. Yes, metadata exists, but it is complex, confusing, often unreliable. My client acted in good faith. The bank cannot be held responsible if family members misuse their own access. It was a weak defense, and everyone knew it." The jury shifted, unimpressed. Daniel seized the moment. "Your Honor, with permission, I'll demonstrate briefly." He played a clip on his laptop, Robert's voice reading from a passage of scripture. Then, with a few keystrokes, he altered the recording. The same voice emerged, but this time it said, "I stole my own money." Gasps filled the air. The demonstration was crude, but enough to show even the least tech-savvy juror what was possible. Michael erupted. "This is insane. That doesn't prove anything about me." His face was flushed, his voice cracking under pressure. For the first time, the mask of calm superiority slipped. The jury watched him unravel, some with narrowed eyes, others shaking their heads in disbelief. Robert rose again, steadier now. He looked directly at Michael. "All I ever asked of you was honesty. I gave you my trust, I gave you my name, and you used both to betray me. Why?" His voice broke, but he pressed on. "Was my sacrifice so little to you? Was 30 years of sweat in the mill just pennies in your eyes?" Michael's composure collapsed. "You don't get it, Dad. You spent your whole life slaving away, living like a pauper. You think saving money makes you noble? It made you pathetic. I wasn't going to waste my life the way you did." The words hung in the air like poison. The spectators murmured in outrage. Some gasped, others shook their heads. Even Lisa stared at him, horrified, her earlier bravado gone. She whispered, barely audible, "Michael, stop." But Michael couldn't stop. His anger had taken control. "You think Daniel's a hero? He lives 3 states away, calling once in a while. He never sacrificed for you. I was here, I did everything, and you still treated me like I was less. So yes, I took the money. I earned it more than you ever did." The judge's gavel slammed down hard. "Mr. Mitchell, sit down." But the damage was done. His outburst had pierced through every lie, every facade. The courtroom now saw not a dutiful son caring for his aging father, but a bitter man who believed theft was justified. Robert sat slowly, his body heavy but his heart strangely lighter. The truth was no longer hidden in shadows. It had been dragged into the light for all to witness. The judge leaned forward, voice stern. "This case has revealed serious allegations of fraud and manipulation. Given the gravity, I will not rush to judgment. The court will recess for a full investigation. We will reconvene once the evidence is thoroughly reviewed." The gavel struck again. "Until then, this session is adjourned." The courtroom erupted, reporters rushing to phones, spectators buzzing. Michael slumped in his seat, his arrogance shattered, while Lisa sat frozen, her eyes wet with silent tears. Daniel wrapped an arm around his father, whispering, "You did it, Dad. The truth is out." Robert looked ahead, his expression weary but resolute. The war was not over, but the turning point had been reached. For the first time, he believed justice was within reach, even if the cost was losing his son forever. The courthouse doors swung open, spilling the crowd into the crisp afternoon air. Reporters surged forward, their microphones like a wall of steel blocking Robert and Daniel as they stepped out. Cameras flashed, voices collided. "Mr. Mitchell, do you feel vindicated?" one reporter shouted. "Do you think your son should go to prison?" asked another. Robert raised a trembling hand, his face pale with exhaustion. "I don't want revenge," he said softly. "I just want the truth." The words carried over the crowd, silencing them for a brief moment. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the raw honesty etched into his lines. A few steps away, Michael and Lisa emerged. Reporters swarmed them instantly. Michael snapped his voice sharp, "No comment." Lisa hissed something under her breath, and the two began arguing, their words caught by every microphone nearby. "You ruined us," Lisa spat. Michael shot back, "You were in on it too." Their marriage unraveled before the nation's eyes. Robert watched from a distance, his heart heavy. He remembered the boy who once clutched a fishing pole by the lake, eager to please his father. Now that same boy stood cornered by cameras, spitting venom at the woman he once swore to love. It was a tragedy, and yet Robert's gaze remained steady. Pain could not erase truth. Betrayal could not bury dignity. Daniel put an arm around his father's shoulder. "We're not done, Dad. Justice is coming." Robert nodded slowly, staring at the flashing lights, the hungry faces of reporters, the storm of judgment swirling around them. Inside, his voice whispered, "Family can break you, but truth will stand." Suddenly, a court clerk stepped onto the courthouse steps, raising his voice above the chaos. "Attention! The court announces a continuation. The fintech company's CEO has been subpoenaed. A new hearing will be scheduled to present further evidence." The crowd erupted again, voices rising with fresh energy. Robert closed his eyes, the sound of the storm washing over him. The battle was far from finished. The war for justice was only beginning. And as he opened his eyes again, determination burned brighter than despair. This was not the end. It was only the cliffhanger. Thank you for staying with us through this emotional journey. Stories like this remind us how fragile trust can be, even within families, and how important it is to stand up for what's right. What do you think? Should Michael face prison for what he did? Or is there still room for forgiveness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I read every single one. If this story moved you, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more true family dramas, and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode. From my heart to yours, thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next story.